If you've just joined us today, we are in the middle of a series called The Miracles of Christ. This is the third week in that series. Pastor Sandeep preached the last 2 weeks, and the first week he brought the first miracle. It was 15,000? 4,000. 4,000. Feeding the 4,000. Last week he talked about Jesus and the paralytic. And this morning, I want to talk about Jesus and the blind man from Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 38. That's a passage for this morning. Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 38. Miracles of Christ. The crescendo will be 25th, the greatest miracle ever. We're building up to that. All right? But this morning, we're going to look at Jesus and the blind man, 22 to 38. Let me give you the context of this passage, what has happened before. Now, Jesus has fed the 4,000. This is the second feeding miracle that the disciples have witnessed. First was the 5,000, then the 4,000, and Jesus feed the 4,000. Now, immediately after performing that miracle, the disciples and Jesus, they get into a boat to cross over. And while they're crossing over, they're having this conversation, and disciples talk about apparently not having bread with them to feed them. And Jesus, perceiving their conversation, he says, haven't you seen, didn't you hear what I just did? 7 loaves feeding 4,000 people, 5 loaves feeding 5,000 people. And you're still talking about not having bread. Don't you understand? Don't you perceive it? Don't you see who I am? Apparently, disciples did not see who really Jesus was. And then they come to our passage. In this passage, there are 3 scenes. 3 scenes. And we're going to look at each scene, one after the other. Scene 1, verses 22 to 26. Verses 22 to 26. Jesus and the blind man. Now, Jesus comes to a town with his disciples called Bethsaida. Now, Bethsaida is a town north of Jerusalem, approximately 150 kilometers north of Jerusalem. Now, Jesus' popularity of him being a miracle worker, of him being a teacher, is spreading all across Israel. So as he lands in Bethsaida with his disciples, some people bring a blind man to Jesus, anticipating and expecting him to touch that man and heal that man. Now, as the man comes to Jesus, Jesus pulls him away from the crowd. He pulls him out of the village and takes him to a secluded area. Jesus doesn't want to perform this miracle in a public sphere. So he pulls him out, takes him to a secluded area, and there he begins the healing process. He spits on man's eyes, covers his eyes with his hands, and he asks that man the question, "Do you now see?" This is an unusual way of healing. Jesus usually doesn't heal like that. He usually speaks or just touches and the healing is performed. This kind of a miracle is only done twice. Recorded thrice, twice in Mark and 1 in the Gospel of John. It's an unusual way of healing. So Jesus spits on his eyes, covers his eyes with his hands and says, "Do you see?" The man replies, "Yes, I see. But I see people walking as trees." That means his vision was not completely restored. His vision was blurry. It was not a complete healing. Now that's unusual. That's very unusual for the Gospels. Because in almost all the miracles, in almost all the healing cases, everything is immediate. Jesus speaks, Jesus touches, it happens. Jesus calms the storm immediately calms down. Jesus calls forth the dead walks out. It's immediate. But in this miracle, the healing is not immediate. The man doesn't see immediately. He sees haze, and then he sees completely. Jesus again repeats the process, and this man now can see completely. This is a 2-stage healing. 2-stage healing process. Doesn't happen immediately. It takes Jesus twice to heal this person. The moment this person is healed, Jesus warns him and tells him, do not go to the village, go straight to your home. Apparently his house was outside the village. He says, don't go back to the public sphere, go home. Don't show yourself to people. Be quiet about it. That ends scene 1. Scene 2, verses 27 to 33. Location is changed now. From Bethsaida, Jesus has come to this place called Caesarea Philippi, which is 40 kilometers further north. And while they are traveling, Jesus asks his disciples a pertinent question. He says, since you are in public sphere, since you are mingling with people, who do people say I am? What is the popular opinion that people have about me? And the disciples reply, something you're Elijah, something you're John the Baptist, and something you're the prophet of old. Net, all of the people, Elijah, John the Baptist, they're all prophets. Net, people believe that you are one of the prophets. It's good. I mean, it's not bad news. It's good news. The office of the prophet was a high office. And so people have high opinion about Jesus. But Jesus is not satisfied with that answer. Of course, he won't be. And so Jesus turns around and asks the disciples, who do you think I am? And Peter, being the spokesperson for the group, he says, you are the Christ. Now this confession deserves a drum roll. This is a big confession. This is a ginormous, gigantic confession. It's a watershed confession for an Israelite. Why? You see, the word Christ is the word Messiah or Mashiach in Hebrew, or the anointed one. You see, in the Old Testament, God promised this deliverer for Israel, this Messiah, this anointed one, this king for Israel. In Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2, this Messiah is speaking, and he says, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. Daniel 2:44, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom, which shall have a king, that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. You see, this Messiah who was promised was to deliver Israel from Roman subjugation. He was to be not a king, but the king, a political, judicial, religious powerhouse who will restore the fortune of Israel. This Messiah was awaited with bated breath. People awaited for this Messiah with longing eyes. They yearned for this Messiah to come because for long they had lived under Roman subjugation, and they wanted freedom. They wanted to go back to the days of glory in the times of David and Solomon, to become once again the crown jewel of God. So when Peter confessed, you are the Christ, it was big. Because what Peter had in his head was the fact that the days of glory are not far ahead. The days of liberation and freedom are not far ahead. The days of ultimate glory of Israel will come back now that the Messiah is here. And the icing on the cake was these disciples were in the inner circle of this Christ, the Messiah. And so the days of glory, power, and position for these disciples are not far ahead. Since they are the closest to this Messiah, when he sits and rules the nations, where will they sit? Next to him. Next to him, elevated above others. It is a big deal. So that is going on in the disciples' head when they say, you are the Christ. And the moment Peter confesses, Jesus throws water in it. He's like, shh, don't tell anyone. Just like the blind man, he said, just don't go in the village, go your home, go to your house. Peter, he says, shh, don't tell anyone. I wonder why this secrecy. Anyways, going ahead, Jesus reveals his plan. He says the Son of Man has to suffer, the Son of Man has to be rejected, he has to die and be raised again. He reveals his plan finally to his disciples. And he says the Son of Man must suffer, must be rejected, must die, and must be raised. Now, Peter can't compute this. All right? Just a minute back, he said, you are the Christ, the King of kings. And now the same king is saying, I must suffer and die. How can that be, Jesus? So he pulls Jesus aside and rebukes him. Now that's a very strong word. The same word is used when Jesus rebukes the wind and calms the storm, and Jesus rebukes the demon. Probably Peter thought something got into Jesus. Jesus turns around and looks at all his disciples, and he rebukes Peter with the sternest and the boldest rebuke. He says, get behind me, Satan. You're not putting your mind on the things of God. You're putting your mind on the things of man. You see, Jesus is saying to Peter, Peter, I am here to suffer. I'm here to die. That is my portion. That is my path. And that is my cup. You, with your worldly understanding, you, with your blurred vision, are being a hindrance to me. You, with your preconceived cultural notions, are being a hindrance to my plan. You see, that there is a reason why these two scenes are together. Pastor Sandeep said 2 weeks ago that Jesus never performs a miracle for the sake of the miracle. There's always a lesson behind it. Do you think Jesus could not have healed this man in one go, the blind man? Easy, piece of cake. But he did not do that. Why? Why? You see, the blind man's two-stage healing was emblematic of the disciples' vision of Christ. Because his disciples were with Jesus all the time, they could see Jesus, but they had a partial vision of Jesus. Jesus had touched them because they walked with him and lived with him, but they still did not have a clear vision of Jesus. It was just partial vision of Jesus. Peter's confession of Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, the deliverer, as iconic as it was still a partial understanding, a partial vision of who the Messiah was or what it meant to be the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one. You see, the blind man's problem was physical illness. He was blind with his eyes. The disciples' problem was spiritual blindness. And I think this partial vision, this disease of having a blurry vision of Christ was not just Peter's problem, was not just disciples' problem, but this pandemic has swept the churches across generations, across boundaries. And unfortunately, this disease of partial vision of Christ is pervasive and prevalent in DBF Central too, where we don't see Christ for who he is. You see, we have signed many documents in life. We have bought a lot of stuff. And when we buy things, there is fine print to it. Terms and conditions. And a lot of times we forget to read the fine print. And later we realize, oops, we should have read the fine print. But in the case of Christ, when we signed the dotted line, when we said that we want to be Christians, we want to be the followers of Christ, we forget or we forgot to read the bold letters written with crimson ink. We forgot to read that somehow, or perhaps we didn't want to read that part, the terms and conditions, to become the followers of Christ. The letters that define for us the life of a Christian, that outlines for us what it means to be a follower of Christ. Jesus says to Peter, Peter, you are putting your mind on the things of this world, not the things of God. What God desires, what God wants, because your sight is colored with the worldview around you. See, a lot of our eyes are colored by the cultural texts prevalent around us. So much so that even when we try to see Jesus for who he is, it's hard. Some of us don't want to see Jesus for who he is. Jesus says to Peter, it is necessary, it is mandatory, it is must that the Son of Man must suffer, be rejected, and die. Peter can't fathom that. How can that be? How can the anointed one, the king, die? Because if this is the fate of my Lord, if this is the fate of my teacher, my master, what will become of my life? Where is all the glory? Where is all the comfort, the position, the throne? If the king is not getting that, how will I get that? We thought life with Jesus will be easy, glorified, without sickness, without trials and troubles. Scene 3. Verses 34 to 38. After rebuking Peter, Jesus turns to the crowd. Looking at his disciples, looking at the crowd, he addresses them and teaches them. And Jesus lays down two prerequisites, two qualifications, or two must-haves, if you were, to be disciples of Christ, to be Christians, to be his followers. First, in verse 34, he says, calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So the first prerequisite or qualification that Jesus puts before the crowd and his disciples is that you must deny yourself. You see, the popular understanding of this concept of self-denial is to bereave yourself of certain pleasure or abstain yourself from certain cultural intoxicants. We understand denying as to abstain from drinking or partying or smoking or becoming wealthy or gossiping or using certain kind of language from a negative point of view. On the other hand, we see denying as becoming very regular to church, coming to church for 52 weeks, 52 Sundays in a year, denying yourself that comfort of Sunday morning, where you can have a lazy Sunday morning. You deny yourself that and you come to church. You think of denying yourself as going to home group after a long day of work, or giving one day to church in ministry. You see, when Jesus says deny yourself, he doesn't mean deny yourself something. Jesus' understanding of denial means to deny self itself. There's a great difference between denying yourself something and denying yourself. Denying the self itself. You see, when Jesus says, deny yourself, he means to give up any right and privilege that your position affords you, whether as a spouse or a parent, whether as an employee or an employer, or as a neighbor. You see, to deny yourself is opposite of self-gratification, is opposite of self-affirmation, is opposite of self-promotion. To deny yourself is not to place any value on your life and on your being before man or God. Paul beautifully expounds this concept in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. To deny yourself is opposite, diametrically opposite to self-centeredness, but it does not also equal other-centeredness. To deny yourself is to be Christ-centered. Christ-centered. To be so consciously aware of Christ. To be so aware of your Christ that your identity, that your desires, that your needs and your wants are conformed to His. To be so aware of Christ in your life. To be so captivated and consumed by Him, so that your identity, your desires, your need, and your wants are conformed to His. That is to deny yourself. The second qualification or prerequisite that Jesus puts before us is to bear our cross. Carry your cross. You see, while to deny yourself is an internal attitude, to carry your cross is the outworking of that internal attitude. Where denying self is the opposite of self-gratification, bearing your cross is the opposite of self-preservation. Safety. Safety. What does it mean to bear your cross? What does it mean to bear your cross? What does cross signify? Cross signifies opposition. Cross signifies pain, shame, suffering, and death. And so when Jesus commands us to bear our cross, He asks us to be ready to bear opposition, shame, pain, suffering, and possible death. For what? For the sake of the gospel. For the sake of the gospel. Many of us are already depressed. How can it be? We are wondering, how did we miss terms and conditions? Written in bold letters. These are red letters, okay? Can't miss them. It's so difficult to live this way. I agree. Christian life is not a child's play. It's not for the faint-hearted. You see, but the good news is Jesus never commands anything without giving us the motivation, without giving us the carrot. Jesus' imperatives are always followed by the indicatives, the truths. When He tells you to do something, He tells you why. He gives you a path, a way around it and under it. The next 4 verses, Jesus gives us 3 motivations as why we need to meet these 2 qualifications, why it is essential for us to meet these 2 qualifications. First, verse 35. He says, for whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Now, Jesus here presents a paradox. He says, whoever will save his life will lose it. Whoever will lose it for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it. Tricky, ain't it? Jesus, talk in English. What are you doing? When Jesus says, whoever will save his life, self-preservation, which is opposite of bearing your cross, Jesus says, all right, what does it mean to bear your cross? Shame, pain, suffering, death. If saving your life is opposite of it, what is the opposite of opposition? Acceptance and approval. What is the opposite of shame? Glory, fame. What is the opposite of pain? Comfort. What is the opposite of death? Safety. Jesus is saying that if your life is all about pursuing acceptance, approval, glory, safety, comfort, you will lose it. You will absolutely lose it. But if you embrace opposition, if you embrace pain, suffering, challenges, trials, for the sake of the gospel, and because of your love for Christ, you will gain it. You will gain it. Therefore, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Jesus goes ahead and asks them two questions. He said, for what profits a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? What can you give in exchange for your soul? Jesus doesn't give you an answer, by the way, for those two questions. Read the passage. It doesn't give you an answer. That means you have to come up with an answer. And the answer is, it profits a man nothing to pursue acceptance, approval, comfort, glory, safety. It profits a man nothing to pursue those things in life at the cost of your soul. John Piper says, nothing, absolutely nothing, nothing in this world, no amount of wealth, no amount of power, no amount of fame can purchase your soul out of hell. But if you exchange the world's offerings with the cross for the sake of the gospel and because you love Jesus, you will gain. You will gain. Therefore, take up your cross and follow me, says Jesus. Finally, verse 38. Jesus says, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of the Father with the holy angels. Question is, why will we be ashamed of Jesus and his words? Jesus' words are to carry your cross. What does that mean? Opposition, suffering, pain, rejection, death. That makes you uncomfortable, isn't it? Makes me uncomfortable. And if I stick to those, if I embrace those words and the path of Jesus, I stand out as a sore thumb. I look foolish in this generation. I'm an embarrassment. And I don't want that. I want approval, acceptance, glory, comfort, safety. Who am I seeking this approval and acceptance from? From godly and wise people? Jesus says, no. From a sinful and an adulterous generation. People who desire the friendship of this world over Jesus. People who want to have a fling with this world rather than have a relationship with Jesus. And Jesus says, for what? You want glory, approval, acceptance instead of Father's glory upon his return, upon my return? Weigh the two. Weigh both of them. He says, no, no, no. Therefore, pick up your cross and follow me. You see, there are only two burdens in this world. And you can carry one of those two. Can't do both. One burden is your burden, the burden of this world. And the other burden is the cross. Jesus gives you a choice, an open choice. On the other hand, Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. It's light. Light? This is light? Yes. Light in comparison to the burden of this world. Because that burden, my dear friends, will crush you for eternity. Following Jesus means Golgotha before glory, cross before the crown, denying self, losing yourself to find yourself. Do you see it? Do you see it? Do you have blurry vision or no vision? Or perhaps clear vision? God bless you. It's interesting. I want to close with this. Interesting that the word deny that Jesus used, the specific word in Greek, is only used in two contexts, two situations. One is here, in this passage. And the second time is when Peter denies Jesus. Peter denies Jesus. When it is time for Peter to choose between self-preservation and bearing his cross, he chooses self-preservation. Peter, rather than denying himself, Peter denies the Lord. But how amazing is the grace of our Lord, that although Peter denied Jesus, Jesus says to Peter, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? How sweet is that grace of our Lord that restores a sinner who denies Jesus. How beautiful is that grace? How beautiful is that grace? You see, both Judas and Peter denied Jesus. The only difference was Peter understood God's grace. It is because of this very grace, the sweet grace that He has so abundantly showered upon us. Take up your cross and follow Jesus. Let's pray. Father, you speak to your people. They sit before you. They live before you. They stand before you. You know their hearts. You know their desires. You know how clear or unclear their vision is of you. And so, Father, I beg you and urge you, would you please speak to your people? If anyone here has a blurred vision of you, Lord, would you please restore their sight? If someone here cannot see you, Father, would you please restore the sight? Jesus said it's good for you to be either hot or cold, but you are lukewarm. Lord, this partial vision makes us lukewarm. And Jesus says, I'll spew you out of my mouth. Father, I beg you and urge you. Meet with your people. Ask the same question that you asked Peter. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And commission your people to carry their cross and follow after you. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, love of God the Father, and the constant communion of the Holy Spirit rest and abide with each one of us through this week and even forevermore. And God's people said, Amen. God bless.